They sold her in the snow, rope at her wrists, sack over her head. 40 people standing in the mud of a Wyoming morning, laughing. She didn't move, didn't bend, didn't give them the collapse they were waiting for. One man at the edge of the crowd stopped laughing. He'd come down the mountain for flour and salt. Simple arithmetic, get in, get out, get back before the storm sealed the passes. Then he saw her spine straight, unbowed, the posture of someone who had decided, somewhere in the dark before this morning, that they would not let this be the thing that broke them. $30 hit the wagon. The crowd went quiet. And somewhere below the Bighorn Range, in a white-painted house on a frozen valley floor, a lamp was already burning in the window of a man who did not let things go. Winter had only just begun. The town of Laramie smelled like coal smoke and cold mud, and the kind of desperation that collects wherever men with money make decisions about people without it. November had come down hard off the Bighorn Range. The kind of hard that turned wagon ruts into frozen ridges sharp enough to twist an ankle, that turned breath into smoke before it left your lips. Thomas Crane rode into it from the North Trail just past 7 in the morning, his chestnut stallion red picking careful steps through the iced-over Main Street, while the saddlebags shifted with the weight of winter pelts. Beaver, mostly. 2 fox. 1 wolf that had made the mistake of circling his cabin 3 nights running before Thomas's patience ran out entirely. He needed flour, salt, maybe nails if Harker's Dry Goods hadn't sold out the good gauge. Then back up the mountain before the next system rolled through, because the clouds stacking themselves over the western peaks had the look of a long storm, the kind that closed the high passes for weeks, and left a man sealed inside his own 4 walls with nothing but wind, and the silence that follows a life lived without anyone else in it. 13 years of that silence. Thomas Crane had stopped counting somewhere around year 7, when counting stopped feeling like grief and started feeling like arithmetic. Red shifted sideways near the feed store, ears flat, and Thomas steadied him with one hand without thinking. The horse had been doing this all morning, reacting to something in the air Thomas couldn't quite name. Not a smell, not a sound. Something closer to a change in pressure, the way animals register weather before it arrives. Then he heard it. Not one voice, many. The crowd had gathered at the open square where the Eastern Freight Road crossed Main Street, which in Laramie's particular understanding of civic planning meant the intersection of 2 frozen mud tracks in front of the land surveyor's office. 40 people, maybe more, pressing in from the side streets, drawn by whatever draws people to other people's worst moments. Not malice, not always, but something close to it. The hunger for spectacle, the relief of watching misfortune from the outside. Thomas pulled Red to a stop at the edge of the gathering and looked over heads at what had assembled itself in the center of the square. An old freight wagon turned on its side in the mud, serving as a platform. Earl Pruitt standing on it in his stained vest and cracked leather shoes, holding a sheet of paper he wasn't reading from, waving it like a document of authority he hadn't otherwise earned. Earl Pruitt, who had owed Thomas $14 since the spring of 1881 and had never once mentioned it. Earl Pruitt, who ran the posting board outside the telegraph office and considered himself a man of business because he charged a nickel to read notices that were supposed to be public. And beside him on the wagon, tied at the wrists to an iron ring, a woman. The rope was thick cattleman's cord, the kind used for branding work. Her hands were bound in front of her, wrists together, the rope running from the iron ring with about 8 inches of slack. Not enough to raise her arms above her waist, not enough to turn without his noticing. Over her head, pulled down to her shoulders, a grain sack. Rough burlap, the kind used to bag oats or corn in bulk. Someone had pulled it over her without any consideration for what was underneath it at all. She was going to be sold. Thomas understood this, the way soldiers understand things mid-battle. Not processed, not reasoned through, just known. The immediate comprehension of a situation that the body registers before the mind finishes assembling the information. He might have left. He had left situations before. He was, by any reasonable measure, a man who had learned the cost of involvement and paid it in the currency of a grief that had not fully departed in 13 years. He had flour to buy. He had a storm coming. He had every reason to turn Red around and find something else to look at, except the woman on the wagon was standing straight. Not defiantly, not theatrically, simply straight. Chin up under the burlap, shoulders squared, weight distributed like someone who had learned to stand on uncertain ground and had decided not to apologize for it. Around her, men were laughing. The crowd was shouting bids and suggestions. Earl Pruitt was doing his best auctioneer voice, pitching her like livestock. describing her in terms of labor capacity and physical utility, as though he were itemizing a plow horse. She did not move. She did not flinch. She did not do the thing Thomas had seen men do in battle when they thought they were about to die. The collapsing inward, the body trying to make itself smaller, the spirit beginning its departure before the body had finished with its business. She stood. Thomas didn't realize he had dismounted until his boots were in the frozen mud and Red's reins were looped over the nearest hitching post. He didn't realize he was moving through the crowd until he was on the other side of it, standing in the open space in front of the wagon where the air smelled like wood smoke and the particular unwashed reality of a November morning. Earl Pruitt saw him and his pitch voice faltered for half a second. Thomas Crane, not a greeting, an assessment. Thomas looked at the woman on the wagon. He looked at the rope, he looked at the iron ring, and then he said, "How much? Not a question. The way you state a number before the other person has decided what it is." Earl blinked. "Well, we're at 7 right now. Started at 5. There's a gentleman who needs someone to scrub floors who's offered 7.5, 20. Thomas said it the way he'd called targets during the war. Clean, no wasted syllable. The crowd went quiet, the way crowds go quiet when something unexpected interrupts the entertainment. 40 people, holding their breath, produced a specific kind of density in the air, loaded with redirected energy. Earl Pruitt's eyes had the look of a man rapidly recalculating. $20, Crane. You haven't even seen her. You don't know what you're. 30. Not because anyone had countered, because Thomas had decided that deliberation was finished. $30. Final. I'm buying her work. He looked at Pruitt and felt something cold and clear move through his chest. Not her face, the silence stretched. No one topped it. Thomas had spent most of his adult life in situations where the question was whether anyone would push back, and he had learned to read the moment when the answer was no. Earl Pruitt grinned the way men grin when they've made unexpected money. He caught the leather pouch. Thomas tossed onto the wagon, and the coins hit with the sound of $30 in silver. Sold to the mountain man. Thomas climbed onto the wagon without asking permission. He untied the rope from the iron ring. Her wrists were red underneath the cord, and he loosened it but did not remove it entirely. Not here, not with 40 people watching, and his own intentions still too unformed to present to witnesses. He stepped down. She stepped down beside him. Both boots hit the frozen mud at the same moment. They walked out of the square under a sky the color of pewter, and nobody tried to stop them, and nobody followed, and the crowd went back to its own life the way crowds do once the entertainment has moved elsewhere. The trail north toward the Bighorn Range climbed steadily through lodgepole pine and bare-branched aspen, the ground firming from mud to packed dirt to the first serious snow accumulation at about 4,000 feet. Thomas rode Red. The woman rode Dust, the bay mare he kept for supply runs, getting on in years but with opinions about terrain he had learned to respect. She handled the mare without instruction, shifting her weight on the steepest switchbacks, with the muscle memory of someone who had ridden regularly and recently, not someone raised behind a plow. He watched this from his peripheral vision and said nothing about it. An hour out of Laramie, when the town had dropped behind a ridge and the only sounds were wind and hoofbeats and the occasional crack of a snow-loaded pine bough finding its limit, Thomas spoke to the trail ahead rather than turning back. "You can take it off. Nobody's watching." He heard the horses. He heard the wind. He heard her breathing, steady in the way that takes conscious effort to maintain. She didn't answer. About 30 seconds later came a small sound, the rasp of burlap against her collar, and when he glanced back she had lifted the sack just far enough to see the trail ahead. Not to breathe better, not to look at the sky, just enough to navigate. The rest of her face remained covered, and the precision of the gesture stayed with Thomas for the remaining 3 hours. She had not trusted his offer enough to take it fully. She had taken exactly what the present moment required and nothing more. He turned back to the trail and didn't raise the subject again. By the time the cabin appeared through the pines, the light had gone flat and gray, and the temperature had dropped another 15 degrees. The structure sat against the north face of a granite shelf, sheltered from the worst of the western wind, close enough to the frozen creek that in spring you could hear the water from the porch. Thomas had built it in 1873, with materials he'd hauled up in 3 separate loads and labor from a Crow trapper named Henry, who had taken payment in 3 good rifles and never returned, which was the nature of most arrangements. Thomas had made north of the timberline. The logs were hand-hewn. The chinking was solid. The roof pitched steep enough to shed the heaviest snow load. It was not a beautiful building. It was a building that worked, which Thomas had decided long ago was the more important quality. He dismounted, tied both horses to the post beside the door, and helped her down without asking whether she needed it. She didn't lean into his hands, but she didn't pull away either. Whatever category she had placed him in was not yet settled. Inside, the banked coals in the stone hearth were still alive, and the cabin came to warmth within 10 minutes of Thomas feeding the fire. Gear along one wall, pelts along the other. The sleeping loft accessed by a ladder on the north side. A table, 2 chairs, a shelf of books and tools, and the occasional object Thomas had kept for reasons that didn't fully survive examination. Everything arranged by one person according to one person's logic, and standing there watching her take it in, Thomas became briefly aware of how completely solitary that logic was. She stood in the center of the room. The burlap sack, now that he was looking at it properly in firelight rather than the flat gray of an auction block, was the kind used to bag grain in bulk. Someone had pulled it over her head with the assumption that whatever was underneath was irrelevant to the transaction. Thomas stood with his back against the door. He had spent 13 years managing the distance between himself and things he couldn't control. And this, all of this, the woman in the center of his cabin with her hands still loosely bound, and the fire catching on the burlap, was about as far outside that management as anything he'd encountered, since the last time men had been shooting at him. "Take it off," he said then, because he heard how that landed in the silence. "I won't send you back." She didn't move for a moment that stretched long enough to hear the fire settle, and one of the horses shift outside, and the wind pick up through the pine crowns on the ridge above. Then her hands came up, not fast. The way you move when you've been bracing for something, and you've decided to stop bracing and simply do the thing. She pulled the sack up and over her head. Thomas had been preparing himself for whatever the truth under the burlap turned out to be, because he had learned in the war and in the long years after it that how you receive news is often more important than the news itself. He was prepared. He was not, as it happened, prepared. She was not what Pruitt had suggested, not what the crowd had implied. She had sharp bones in her face, the kind of structure that catches light from 2 directions at once, and pale skin in the way of someone who had spent recent months indoors against their nature, and dark reddish-brown hair that had been braided once, and was now mostly not, falling loose to her shoulders. Her left eye was clear green, the particular green of shallow creek water in summer. Her right eye was dark gray, not blue-gray, not hazel, but a settled mineral gray like granite seen through cloud cover. 2 colors, same face. Both of them watching him now with the expression of someone who has spent a long time waiting to see what the person across from them does next. There was a scar on her left cheek. It ran from the high point of her cheekbone down to the corner of her jaw in a line that was too straight, too precise, too geometrically deliberate to have been caused by anything accidental. Thomas had treated knife wounds in the war, had stitched men up in field tents by lantern light. He knew what a wound looked like when made in panic or in motion, the jagged record of 2 people in violent contact. This had been made by someone standing still, someone calm, someone who had taken their time. She said, "Well," her voice was level in a way that cost something to maintain. "Do I look cursed?" Thomas moved from his position at the door, not toward her, not retreating, just shifting from one stance to another. He looked at the scar the way he would look at sign in the snow, reading what it said about the event that produced it. "Who cut you?" Not a question. He had stopped framing certain things as questions sometime during the war, when he'd learned that the question form gave people an exit he didn't always want to provide. She said, "My husband." The word arrived in the room and took up space. She told him the rest in pieces, sitting in one of the 2 chairs at the table while Thomas fed the fire, and then sat in the other chair and did nothing with his face that would give her a reason to stop. Her name was Ada Merrill. Her father had been Harold Merrill, schoolteacher out of Carson Flats, a man who had believed that education was the most permanent thing you could give a person, and had spent 30 years giving it to anyone who would sit still long enough to receive it. He had died of a lung ailment when Ada was 20, which had left her in a town with more opinions about her options than options themselves. Curtis Holt had appeared to be an option. Thomas knew the name the way you know the names of geographic features you have been told to stay away from. Holt's ranch sat in the lower valley below the Bighorn approach, the largest single cattle operation in the territory by acreage, the kind of spread that made other ranchers do their arithmetic carefully before deciding whether a dispute was worth pursuing. Curtis Holt was in his early 40s, had been married once before, with results that people in Laramie discussed in the careful, vague language used for things nobody could prove, and had money enough to make that careful language self-sustaining indefinitely. He had married Ada Merrill 7 months after Harold Merrill's funeral. Ada had been 20 years old and in possession of her father's library, her father's habits of mind, and approximately nothing else in the material sense. She laid the facts in their order without editorializing, and Thomas heard all the things she didn't say in the spaces between the things she said. The marriage had not been a marriage. It had been a transaction conducted under the legal framework of marriage, which Holt had understood entirely, and Ada had understood only after the ceremony was completed. He had not wanted a wife. He had wanted an arrangement with the legal architecture to make itself permanent. She had remained for 14 months, which Thomas was not going to calculate into anything, because it was not his calculation to make. Then she had stopped remaining. The specific mechanism of that stopping she described in a sentence so compressed it contained almost no air. She had refused him once. Clearly, in a way that could not be reframed, Holt had waited until the following morning, when Ada was in the kitchen, to respond. He had come in with his work knife, the one he kept sharpened for marking cattle, and he had cut her face. Not in anger, not in the heat of anything. He had done it with the same deliberate calm he would use to make any mark of ownership. When it was done, he looked at her and said, "No man will ever want to look at you again." Then he had ridden to Laramie and told everyone who would listen, and everyone would listen, because he had money, and money is the most effective amplifier of any narrative. That his wife had attempted to poison him, that she had become unstable, that she had always been strange, which was easy enough to make people believe about. A woman with 2 different colored eyes in a town that treated strangeness as a form of threat. The story had traveled faster than Ada could have ridden. Even if she'd had somewhere to ride to, Thomas sat with this. The fire worked in the grate. Outside, the wind moved through the high timber with the sound of something that had been moving for a long time and had no intention of stopping. Then he said, "He'll come up here." Ada looked at him steadily. "Curtis Holt doesn't release things he considers his property. Then we make sure he finds something different from what he expects." He crossed to the door and checked the bar, checked the south window. The rifle above the door was loaded, always loaded. Because a rifle you have to load in the moment you need it is furniture, not a weapon. He took the spare rifle from the east wall and set it on the table between them. Ada looked at the rifle, then at Thomas. Something shifted in her expression, not relief, because relief wasn't available yet, but recognition. The recognition of someone who has been waiting for the floor to drop out from under them and has found, unexpectedly, that there is another floor below the first one. "You take the loft," Thomas said. "I'll sleep by the door," she said. "You're not afraid of me," he said. "I've seen worse than scars, and I don't put much stock in what other people decide to call a curse." She climbed the ladder to the loft without another word. Thomas settled into his chair by the fire with the rifle across his knees and listened to the wind build outside, and the horses settle in the lean-to and the small sounds from above, that were the sounds of a person arranging themselves in a space that was not yet theirs. He did not sleep until well past midnight. The days that followed had texture. Not the emptiness of the solitude Thomas had built for himself over 13 years, but something with friction and weight. 2 people moving through the same space according to different logics, learning each other's patterns the way you learn the grain of wood before you work it. Ada moved through the cabin with purpose. She cooked with the confidence of someone who had learned cooking as a form of knowledge rather than a domestic obligation. Her father's kitchen, a laboratory of practical chemistry, salt and heat, and time as the operative variables. She mended Thomas's torn coat with small, tight stitches that were better than his own. She swept. She reorganized the supply shelf on the east wall, with a system Thomas couldn't fully decode, but which seemed to work better than whatever had preceded it, which was closer to no system than he liked to admit. He returned from checking his trapline on the 3rd afternoon to find her at the window in the low winter light, the old Bible from his shelf open in her lap. Not reading scripture, the book was open to the back cover, where Thomas had kept a set of topographical maps folded for 15 years. Maps that had served him equally in the war and on the mountain. Maps that no one else had ever looked at, because no one else had been in his cabin long enough to reach the bookshelf. He stopped in the doorway. "You can read those." She looked up. Something moved in her expression that was not quite pleasure but was adjacent to it. carefully managed. My father made maps part of the curriculum. He said knowing where you stand in relation to everything around you was the most practical form of literacy there is. Her finger moved along an elevation contour. He was right about most things. Thomas sat down across from her. The fire was low and he should have built it up, but he didn't move to do it yet. He looked at her, looking at the maps. He said, "How long were you with him?" she said. "Until I was 20, a pause that fit precisely between two facts. Long enough to learn what a house is supposed to feel like." Thomas was quiet with that for a moment. Then he said something he had not planned to say, had not arranged into words before this particular evening, possibly had never arranged into words at all. Margaret had died in the winter of 71. Not from anything dramatic. A fever that climbed too fast in a location too far from any doctor who could have done something about it in time. She had been 28 years old. She had been, in Thomas's experience and estimation, the person most equipped to navigate the world of anyone he had ever encountered, which made the randomness of her death a kind that doesn't have a clean name. He had ridden 14 miles across frozen ground for the doctor. He had arrived back 5 hours later to find that 5 hours had been too long. He had done everything he could find to do, and she had died anyway. And the gap between what he was capable of and what that situation required had been so large that he had never found the bottom of it from the edge. He told Ada the short version, which was honest if compressed, and then he said the thing he had known for 13 years but not assembled into language until that evening. "I moved up here because the mountain doesn't require anything from you that you can't give it. It doesn't ask you to be enough. It just asks you to be careful." He looked at the fire. "Being careful is something I know how to do." Ada was quiet for a moment. Then, "Being careful and being present aren't the same thing." He looked at her. She was looking at the maps. The scar on her cheek, in this light, looked like something the fire itself had drawn there. Part of the same warm palette belonging to the scene rather than interrupting it. He said, "No. They're not." She turned and met his gaze. His phone never stopped ringing. Neither of them said the thing that was present in the room, because it was still some weeks ahead of where they actually were, and they were both people who understood the difference between where you are and where the current is carrying you. On the 6th day, the weather that had been stacking itself over the western peaks arrived not as a slow build but as a decision. The temperature dropping 20 degrees in 4 hours, the snow starting at midday and accelerating into something with velocity and intention. Thomas spent the afternoon bringing in wood and checking the lean-to, packing the gaps around the door with extra rags, doing the maintenance work of a man who had survived many winters alone and had learned not to be casual about any of it. He came out of the lean-to in the early evening with his arms full of split pine and stopped. The snow in front of the cabin had been walked on, not by him. Not recently. He set the wood down slowly and crouched, ignoring the cold working through his knee, and read the tracks with the attention he would have given them in any tactical situation. 3 sets. Horses, not deer. Heavy animals, well shod. Not the rangy footwear of stock worked hard every day. These were purpose-kept horses. The prints circled the north and east walls in a deliberate arc, close enough to the cabin that one of the animals had stepped within 4 feet of the corner log, and then departed south in the direction of the lower valley. Not recent. 2 hours, maybe 2.5, made before the snow had come down hard enough to obscure detail. They had come, circled, observed, and left. Not an approach, a reconnaissance. Thomas stood and looked at the tree line for long enough that the feeling left his fingers inside his gloves. Then he went inside. Ada was at the table with the maps again, this time looking at the lower valley section, and she looked at his face when he came through the door and set the maps down without being asked. He said, 3 sets of tracks. Fresh. Circled the cabin and went back south. She absorbed this in the way of someone whose prediction has just been confirmed, which is its own category of bad news, worse in some respects than pure surprise, because it closes the door on the possibility that you were wrong to worry. "He's not impulsive," she said. "People make the mistake of thinking a man who does violence calmly is more in control than one who does it in anger." Curtis Holt came up here to measure the situation before he commits to it. She looked at the maps. He wants to know what he's walking into. Thomas looked at the window. Outside, the battered light was gone entirely, and the storm had settled into its full register. "Then he has his answer," he said. "And he'll come back with a plan," she said. "Yes," he said. "You know how to shoot." It was not a question the second time he asked it either, though the first time had been in the chaos of what was about to arrive, and this time was something more deliberate. Confirmation before the fact rather than during it. She said, "My father believed that practical education included the means of protecting it. He took the spare rifle from the wall and held it out. She took it, checked the action with the assurance of someone taught correctly, and held it at a natural angle that communicated where she intended to be if what was coming arrived. Outside, the wind had reached the kind of sustained pressure that found every gap in the walls and tested it. And under the wind, a sound that was not wind, not the crack of a loaded bough, the sound of a horse carrying a rider's weight through crusted snow, trying for quiet and not entirely achieving it, then a voice, not shouting, not approaching with noise, because noise was what you used when you wanted someone to feel the size of what was coming. This voice came through the door and the walls at a volume that was almost conversational, carrying across the cold air with the ease of sound in deep winter. Curtis Holt said, "Ada, come home." She went still in a way that was not frozen stillness. The body was still processing, converting anticipated fear into actual presence, finding it neither larger nor smaller than expected. She looked at Thomas. He moved to the wall beside the door. "You take the east wall," he said quietly. "Cover the rear from the corner angle." She was already moving there before he finished the sentence, from outside. "You don't belong with that animal. Come home and this is finished tonight." Thomas said nothing back, because responding to that framing was not something he intended to do on any timeline. The sound of horses redistributing. More than one. He counted the weight transfers and the breathing patterns audible even through the walls. Closer to 5 than 3. Then the first shot came through the window. Glass and lead and cold air arrived simultaneously. The lamp on the shelf went dark. The fire threw everything into moving shadow. Thomas felt the displaced air pass within inches of his left ear and heard the round hit the far wall with the sound of a fist striking hardwood. He pulled the door open 4 inches, found the muzzle flash still hanging in the dark and fired. A short hard sound from outside, not a scream, the compressed sound of impact, and then horses shifting and voices in fast communication. From the east wall, Ada's rifle spoke once. Silence for 3 seconds. From the tree line, Holt's voice. And for the first time something had shifted underneath the composure. Not the composure itself. What was underneath it? "This isn't finished." Thomas loaded, watching the broken window. "Rear door." He said Ada was already there. He heard the hammer draw back and the subtle repositioning of her feet on the board floor. The rear latch began to move, slowly. The deliberate testing of a man who has done this before and knows that patience at this stage costs nothing. Without waiting for it to open, Ada fired through the wood. A body hit the ground outside. After that, the silence that arrives after gunfire and lasts exactly long enough to confirm that the immediate exchange is over before the weight of it starts to arrive. Thomas crossed to the broken window and looked into the dark and the falling snow. Through the timber at the south edge of the clearing, a single shape was moving away on horseback. Not wounded, not retreating in defeat, but moving with the deliberate economy of a man who has gathered what he came for and is returning to plan with the new information. Holt's voice came back one final time, already absorbed by distance and snowfall. "This isn't over." Thomas stood at the broken window until the sound of hoofbeats was completely gone. Then he watched the tree line for another 30 seconds, because the silence after a fight was exactly where bad decisions lived if you filled it too fast. He turned around. Ada was standing in the center of the cabin. The rifle was still in her hands, and her hands were not shaking. Her breathing was measured with the controlled evenness of something deliberately maintained. She was looking at the door she had fired through, and on her face was an expression Thomas recognized from the far side of First Combat. Not the absence of fear, but the particular clarity that follows the discovery that you are still standing when you expected. Somewhere in the calculus of the preceding minutes, that you might not be, he crossed the room to her. He put his hand on the barrel of her rifle and eased it toward the table, not taking it from her, just redirecting its weight. "She let him," she said. "He'll come back with more men." Thomas looked at the broken window, at the snow blowing in through it, at the Wyoming night beyond, in which something had just decided to become something larger. He thought about the way Holt's voice had stayed level through all of it, not the level of a man forcing control, but the level of a man who had never needed to force it, who moved through violence the way he moved through any other business transaction. With the patience of someone who considered the outcome already determined and was simply working the necessary steps, he said, "Then when he does, he'll find we've had time to prepare." He pulled a board across the broken window frame, and began fitting it tight against the cold. Ada set her rifle on the table and picked up a second piece of wood from the stack by the hearth and helped without being asked, without discussion, the work dividing itself between them the way work divides between two people who have arrived at a shared understanding of what needs doing. The fire crackled. The storm pressed against the walls. Somewhere down the mountain, in the direction of a white-painted house on a hill above the frozen valley floor, a lamp was still burning. The storm lasted 3 days. Not the kind that builds gradually and releases cleanly and leaves the world simplified. The kind that commits, pressing down on the roof with the full weight of a Wyoming November, making the walls creak in a way that was not threatening, but was also not entirely reassuring. A sound like the building reminding you it had been assembled by human hands and human hands make errors. Thomas had survived 18 winters above the timberline, and he knew the math of this one before it finished its first day. 4 feet in the open clearing before it stopped. The high trail south impassable for at least a week after. Drifts up took 6 feet in the places where the prevailing wind came around the granite shelf and lost its momentum. Whatever was below them in the valley was going to stay below them. And whatever was below them in the valley knew it too. Ada moved through the cabin on that first storm morning with the focused intentions of someone who had decided that the previous night was not going to define the space she occupied going forward. She cleaned the floor, where cold had blown in through the repaired window. Thomas had stuffed it with wool blanket and scrap wood before the worst of the blow arrived, but the seam was imperfect and the board floor had taken cold air and grit through the night. She moved the extra ammunition from the east shelf to the table, sorted by caliber, accessible without being conspicuous. She sharpened the kitchen knife against the whetstone above the wash basin, with the focused attention of someone who had decided that every tool within reach was going to be at its best capacity going forward. Thomas watched her do all of this, and didn't offer to help and didn't offer commentary. There are forms of processing that require an audience only in the sense of requiring someone who will not interrupt. On the second night of the storm, he woke in the early hours to a sound from the loft. Quiet. The specific effort of someone trying to produce no sound at all. And underneath that, not quite contained, crying. He lay still and listened and made a decision. He did not climb the ladder. He did not call up to her. He pulled himself upright, crossed to the hearth, and fed the fire until it was throwing real heat. And then he sat down in his chair and said to the room at a volume calculated to reach the loft, without requiring acknowledgement. Bad dreams are just the mind catching up to what the body already came through. The sound from the loft stopped. Not immediately. Over about 30 seconds, the way a storm ends, in stages, each quieter than the last. Several minutes passed. Then Ada's feet appeared on the ladder rungs, and then the rest of her. And she came and sat in the other chair, and they stayed that way for the better part of 2 hours without speaking. Both of them looking at the fire, while the storm worked against the walls, and the horses shifted in the lean-to, and the world outside reduced itself to white noise and cold. Eventually she said, "I dreamed he found me here. Except in the dream there was no one else." Thomas kept his eyes on the fire. He's a man with land and guns and hired help. Same rules apply to him as to any other man who decides he has rights he hasn't earned. She turned to look at him, and he felt the weight of both eyes on the side of his face. "You were a soldier, Union Cavalry, 3rd Division. What did you learn?" He was quiet for a moment that had genuine thought in it, not the pause of someone arranging a performance of an answer. That the mind gets loud before a fight. Then the first shot happens and the noise stops, and after that it's just the work in front of you. He looked at her then. The man who scares you is loud in the approach. When the shooting starts, he weighs the same as anyone else. Ada looked back at the fire. "He doesn't think he's frightening," she said. "He thinks he's correcting. There's a difference. A man who knows he's doing wrong can be shamed into hiding it, at least." Curtis Holt has a whole architecture in his mind that makes what he does feel like order being restored, a beat. That's what makes him harder to stop than a man who's just angry. Thomas considered this carefully, because it was accurate in a way he hadn't approached from precisely that angle. She had lived inside that architecture for 14 months. She knew its load-bearing walls better than anyone outside it could. "Then we don't argue with the architecture," he said. "We remove it." Neither of them returned to the loft after that. They sat until the eastern sky differentiated itself from the darkness, and then Ada made coffee from the tin she had found at the back of the supply cabinet. Real coffee. not the chicory substitute Thomas had been rationing since September. And they drank it in the gray morning light while the storm continued outside with undiminished commitment. The storm lasted 3 days. Not the kind that builds gradually and releases cleanly and leaves the world simplified. The kind that commits, pressing down on the roof with the full weight of a Wyoming November, making the walls creak in a way that was not threatening but was also not entirely reassuring. A sound like the building reminding you it had been assembled by human hands, and human hands make errors. Thomas had survived 18 winters above the timberline, and he knew the math of this one before it finished its first day. 4 feet in the open clearing before it stopped. The high trail south impassable for at least a week after, drifts up to 6 feet in the places where the prevailing wind came around the granite shelf and lost its momentum. Whatever was below them in the valley was going to stay below them. And whatever was below them in the valley knew it too. Ada moved through the cabin on that first storm morning, with the focused intention of someone who had decided that the previous night was not going to define the space she occupied going forward. She cleaned the floor where cold had blown in through the repaired window. Thomas had stuffed it with wool blanket and scrap wood before the worst of the blow arrived. But the scene was imperfect, and the board floor had taken cold air and grit through the night. She moved the extra ammunition from the east shelf to the table, sorted by caliber, accessible without being conspicuous. She sharpened the kitchen knife against the whetstone above the wash basin with the focused attention of someone who had decided that every tool within reach was going to be at its best capacity going forward. Thomas watched her do all of this, and didn't offer to help and didn't offer commentary. There are forms of processing that require an audience only in the sense of requiring someone who will not interrupt. On the second night of the storm, he woke in the early hours to a sound from the loft. Quiet. The specific effort of someone trying to produce no sound at all, and underneath that, not quite contained, crying. He lay still and listened and made a decision. He did not climb the ladder. He did not call up to her. He pulled himself upright, crossed to the hearth, and fed the fire until it was throwing real heat. And then he sat down in his chair and said to the room, at a volume calculated to reach the loft, without requiring acknowledgement, "Bad dreams are just the mind catching up to what the body already came through." The sound from the loft stopped. Not immediately, over about 30 seconds, the way a storm ends, in stages, each quieter than the last. Several minutes passed. Then Ada's feet appeared on the ladder rungs, and then the rest of her, and she came and sat in the other chair, and they stayed that way for the better part of 2 hours without speaking. Both of them looking at the fire, while the storm worked against the walls and the horses shifted in the lean-to, and the world outside reduced itself to white noise and cold. Eventually she said, "I dreamed he found me here. Except in the dream there was no one else." Thomas kept his eyes on the fire. He's a man with land and guns and hired help. Same rules apply to him as to any other man who decides he has rights he hasn't earned. She turned to look at him and he felt the weight of both eyes on the side of his face. "You were a soldier, Union Cavalry, 3rd Division. What did you learn?" He was quiet for a moment that had genuine thought in it, not the pause of someone arranging a performance of an answer. That the mind gets loud before a fight. Then the first shot happens and the noise stops, and after that it's just the work in front of you. He looked at her then. The man who scares you is loud in the approach. When the shooting starts, he weighs the same as anyone else. Ada looked back at the fire. "He doesn't think he's frightening," she said. "He thinks he's correcting. There's a difference. A man who knows he's doing wrong can be shamed into hiding it, at least. Curtis Holt has a whole architecture in his mind that makes what he does feel like order being restored. A beat. That's what makes him harder to stop than a man who's just angry." Thomas considered this carefully, because it was accurate, in a way he hadn't approached from precisely that angle. She had lived inside that architecture for 14 months. She knew its load-bearing walls better than anyone outside it could. "Then we don't argue with the architecture," he said. "We remove it." Neither of them returned to the loft after that. They sat until the eastern sky differentiated itself from the darkness, and then Ada made coffee from the tin she had found at the back of the supply cabinet. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute Thomas had been rationing since September. And they drank it in the gray morning light while the storm continued outside with undiminished commitment. The 4th morning arrived with the clarity that follows major weather, hard blue sky. The pine trees had shed their snow loads in the night and stood dark and definite against the white. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, which meant the snowpack had compressed and crusted, and would hold weight without collapsing. Thomas registered this with the part of his attention that never stopped reading terrain, because in his experience the terrain was always communicating something. He went out early, before Ada was down from the loft, before the light had fully committed to the day. He found the tracks at the north corner of the cabin. 5 horses, not 3. 5 distinct sets of prints in the snow that had fallen after the worst of the storm, meaning they had come during the storm itself, in darkness and weather, when a man would expect a cabin's occupants to be sealed inside and inattentive. The prints followed the same deliberate arc as before, close enough to the structure that one of the animals had placed a hoof within 4 feet of the corner log, and then departed south. These were not the tracks of men acting on anger. Anger arrives fast and loud and leaves evidence of its own impatience. These tracks had the geometry of men operating under clear instruction, taking their time, doing exactly what they had come to do and nothing beyond it. Thomas crouched in the snow and studied the depth and compression. 2 in the morning, maybe 2:30. They had come in the deepest part of the night, in the worst of the blow, which meant they had ridden up through a storm to gather information. The horses were heavy-bodied animals, well-shod, not the casual footwear of ranch stock worked daily. These animals were kept for specific work. He stood and looked south toward the valley he couldn't see from here. He stood there long enough that the feeling left his fingers inside his gloves, and he did not attend to it. Then he went back inside. Ada was at the table. She had the lower valley section of the maps open, and she was looking at the western edge of what he recognized as the Holt Ranch perimeter, her finger tracing a route between the timber line and a structure marked at the far boundary of the property. She looked up at his face when he came through the door and did not ask the question, just waited. 5, he said, in the night. During the storm, she absorbed this the way she absorbed most things, not with visible reaction, but with the quiet intake of someone adding a new fact to a calculation already in progress. She looked back at the map. He sent them during the blow, so we'd have no warning and no clear tracks to find afterward. He didn't expect the snow to stop when it did. She touched the mark on the western boundary of the Holt property. He's not angry. He's planning. Thomas sat down across from her. What are you looking at? She turned the map so he could see it properly. Her finger rested on a structure marked at the far western edge of the ranch. The supply barn. It sits separated from the main house by the full width of the yard, close enough to the road that it's accessible without approaching the bunkhouse or the main building, far enough from both that fire there wouldn't threaten them directly. She looked up. It holds his winter hay, his corn, reserve feed for the horses, his tack and equipment stores. Without it, he can't sustain his stock through February. He'd have to buy feed from the Carroll operation at the north end of the valley. Carroll overcharges, and Holt knows it, since the transaction would be visible to everyone in the valley, because Carroll has never kept a confidence in his life. Thomas looked at the map. He looked at the distances, the terrain between the timber and the barn, the position of the bunkhouse relative to the approach angle, and he'd have to pull men back from whatever he's planning up here to manage the logistics. Right now, he chooses the timing, she said. He decides when to move, how many to bring, what we know and when we know it. This changes that. She held his gaze. He should know it was us. He should have to stand in his valley and decide what story he tells about why the woman he sold at auction came down off the mountain and took something of his. A pause. He's been writing the story about me for a long time. It's time the story had a different author. Thomas sat with this. He had spent his adult life making decisions under pressure, under fire, under grief, under the particular pressure of options where none of them were good. He had learned to distinguish between decisions made from clarity and decisions made from damage. This was not made from damage. This was made by someone who had done the arithmetic between 14 months of captivity and 6 weeks of something different, and had arrived at a clear answer through a process that had nothing impulsive in it. We ride at dusk, he said. She said. Yes, he said. You understand what this starts. She looked at him steadily with both of her different-colored eyes. I understood what Curtis Holt started when he came up here with 5 armed men in the middle of the night. I'm finishing the sentence, he began. They rode south as the last light left the sky, the temperature dropping in the sharp, specific way of mountain evenings in November when the sun goes behind the western ridge and takes every degree of warmth with it inside 20 minutes. Thomas on red, Ada on dust, both horses sure-footed on the crusted snow, moving through the lower pine forest at an angle that kept them off the main trail and within the shadow of the tree line. Ada rode without instruction, selecting the same lines Thomas would have chosen, avoiding the open saddles where the moonlight would throw a silhouette against the white. He glanced back at her once. She was looking at the trail ahead. Her rifle was slung across her back. The scar on her cheek caught the moonlight and held it the way scars do. New tissue, having a different relationship with light than the surrounding skin. The mark reading as a line drawn by someone who had possessed both the means and the patience to draw it. Thomas looked at it and thought about what it had cost, what it was supposed to cost, what it had actually cost, measured against what it had been intended to produce. And he found himself carrying a quiet, specific anger he had not asked for and did not try to put down. He turned back to the trail. The valley opened below them as they came through the last stand of timber, before the tree line broke onto the lower slopes. The Holt Ranch spread across the frozen flat in a way that communicated its scale even in the dark. The main house with its two lit windows, the long dark shape of the bunkhouse to the east, the smaller outbuildings arranged in the functional geometry of a working operation that had never had to justify itself to anyone. And at the western edge, separated from everything else by the width of the main yard, the supply barn. Dark, enormous. The repository of everything Curtis Holt needed to carry his operation through the winter. They left horses in the tree line with reins looped once around a pine branch. Enough hold to prevent wandering, not enough to trap them if something went wrong. Thomas checked the yard. No movement near the barn. The bunkhouse windows were lit, and the shadows behind them were the shadows of men keeping warm, attending their fire, not the dark outside it. The main house showed one lamp at the far window, ground floor, the kind left burning when someone is awake but occupied with something interior. They moved through the snow with the economy of people trained by different teachers in different circumstances to move without waste. 20 yards from the barn, Thomas stopped and listened. The settling sounds of stored materials, timber contracting in the cold, no sound that suggested a human presence. He nodded once. Ada moved to the barn door. Inside smelled like dry hay and engine oil and the deep dusty sweetness of stored grain. Bales stacked 12 feet high to the rafters, barrels along the east wall holding corn and oat, tack hanging in ordered rows. Everything Curtis Holt needed to run his ranch through February, assembled in one location by a man who had never had reason to consider that his storage might not be secure. Thomas put his hand on Ada's arm, not to stop her, just present, weight given to the moment before it changed. No going back after this. She looked at him in the dark of the barn, both eyes holding whatever light was available, and said, "I've been past no going back for longer than you know." She drew a small tin lantern from inside her coat, flint and steel. The spark caught on the third streak, and the small flame threw a circle of warmth that was entirely at odds with its purpose. She looked at the hay bales. She looked at the flame. She looked at Thomas once more, and in her face was not cruelty and not recklessness, but the expression of someone who has decided that absorbing an injustice passively is itself a choice, and she was choosing differently. She tipped the lantern into the base of the nearest bale. The fire took slowly at first, exploring the possibility before committing. And then the commitment arrived, and Thomas and Ada were already moving back through the barn door into the cold, walking at first, then their pace accelerating as the orange light began to show through the barn's gaps and cracks, and the smell of burning hay reached the open air. From the bunkhouse, nothing yet. From the main house, the lamp unchanged. They were at the tree line before the first shout went up. Then more shouting. Men pouring out of the bunkhouse with the lurching energy of people pulled from warmth into emergency, and the sound of the fire was fully audible now. The deep consuming sound of something large giving itself over, and the light above the tree line where Thomas and Ada stood with their horses painted the underside of the low clouds in copper. From the main house, a door opening, a figure on the porch. Thomas watched from 200 yards in the dark as Curtis Holt came out without his hat, coat half on, and stood and looked at his barn burning. He did not run toward it, did not shout, did not produce any of the reactions of a man caught by surprise. He stood still and looked with the expression of a man receiving new information and updating his model of the situation. Then he turned and looked toward the tree line. He could not have seen them. The distance was too great, the darkness between them complete, and the fire behind him had destroyed whatever night vision he might have had. But he turned and looked at precisely the location where they stood, and Thomas would think about Lester, lying awake in the cabin with the fire low. Not that Holt had looked, but that he had looked at the right place. Ada was watching too, she said quietly. He knows, Thomas said. Yes, she said. Good. And her voice carried something that was not triumph, because triumph implies surprise. And what Ada Merrill felt in that moment was something older and more settled than surprise. It was the sound of a sentence being written by the person it was about. For the first time, they rode back up the mountain under the stars. For most of the climb, they were silent. Near the upper timber line, where the trail leveled briefly before the final approach to the cabin, Ada let Dust slow to a walk, and Thomas let Red match the pace without comment. The cold was deep up here, the kind that clarified everything it touched, and the sky above the peaks was doing what Wyoming skies do at elevation on clear nights. Showing you all of it at once, every star in its position, the whole overwhelming inventory of distance. She said, I hadn't laughed in almost 2 years. Thomas looked at her. She said, not since before my father died. I'd forgotten it was something I did. He didn't respond immediately because it wasn't a statement that needed a response. It was an accounting, a small private audit offered to the night air and to the one person present. After a moment he said, well, you'll have occasion. She looked at him with a faint expression that was not quite a smile and not quite its absence. You sound very certain of that, I am, he said simply, and turned Red back toward the upper trail. 2 days passed without movement from the valley. Clean, cold days, the sky bright and indifferent, the snow on the open slopes throwing back so much light that the hours between 10 and 2 were almost warm. Thomas checked his trap lines. Ada continued her inventory of the supply situation and identified that the salt supply was adequate through February and the coffee was not, a finding she delivered with the dry precision of someone who had decided that accuracy was more useful than comfort. On the evening of the second day, she asked him about the photographs on the shelf. Not directly. She asked about the house in the second photograph. A daguerreotype of a frame building Thomas didn't have anymore. And Thomas told her about the place outside of Sheridan he had bought in 1868 and sold in 1873 because owning land you could not find a reason to stand on turned out to be a form of punishment rather than possession. And then Ada waited, and Thomas understood what the waiting was for. He told her about Margaret, not the version compressed for utility but something closer to the actual shape of it. The woman herself first, before the ending of her, because she had existed as a person before she existed as a loss, and Thomas had spent 13 years reversing that order in his own memory, and he was tired of it. Margaret, who had been funny in the specific way of someone who sees the world clearly and decides not to be defeated by the seeing. Margaret, who had believed in the ranch the way you believe in something you are building from raw material, with the full investment of someone who understands that partial commitment builds nothing. When he reached the winter of 71, he told it plainly. The fever, the ride for the doctor across 14 miles of frozen ground, the return 5 hours later, the arithmetic of 5 hours. He had done everything available to him. The full catalog of his capabilities, everything he had learned in 4 years of war, everything he'd built in the 3 years after it, had amounted, in the end, to not enough. And the distance between what he was capable of and what that situation required was the thing he had never been able to close. And the 13 years on the mountain were, among other things, a sustained effort not to encounter that distance again. Ada listened to all of it without filling the silences. When he finished, she said, the man who came down the mountain for flour and walked up to an auction block instead. That wasn't a stranger being generous. That was someone who recognized being made to stand still while something wrong happened in front of him. Thomas looked at her. Maybe, she said. Not maybe, she held his gaze. I know the difference between a man doing a kind thing and a man who physically cannot make himself look away. You were the second kind. He sat with that for a while. Outside, the Wyoming night was doing what it did, cold and clear and indifferent and enormous. And the fire in the grate was doing what it did. And for the first time in a long time, the silence in the cabin did not feel like the silence of one person. The attack came on the third night after the burning of the barn, and it came not as an impulsive response but as the execution of a plan. The 2-day pause being, Thomas understood in retrospect, not hesitation but preparation. Curtis Holt did not move on anger. He moved on decisions. The pause had been him assembling his resources and selecting his approach and confirming his information. And what arrived on that third night was the result of all of that assembly. It began with fire. A burning torch arsed out of the dark and struck the lean-to roof while Thomas was at the woodpile. and the dry overhang caught before he had crossed half the distance to the water barrel. He shouted for Ada while his hands were already moving toward the nearest bucket. And she was through the cabin door and reaching for the second bucket before the first rider came around the north corner of the clearing at a hard gallop. 5 of them, moving from 3 different angles with the coordination of men who had walked this terrain in daylight and knew where every shadow fell. And in the center of the clearing, not on horseback, standing on the ground, Curtis Holt, coat open despite the cold, arms at his sides. The same posture he had held on his porch while his barn burned, watching someone else's emergency with the patience of a man who had calculated the outcome in advance and was merely observing its arrival. He said, "Ada," and his voice was exactly the same volume it had been through the broken window a week before. Not raised, not strained, the voice of a man who does not need volume because he has never encountered a situation his authority did not eventually resolve. "Come home. This is already more than it needs to be." Adi was at the lean-to with the second bucket, and the fire on the overhang was losing ground when the first shot from the North Rider punched through the cabin wall. Thomas returned fire without the gap between perception and action, the way wrestlers trained over years replaced deliberation under pressure. And the North Rider's horse screamed and bolted, and the rider went with it, which removed one variable from the count. Inside, Thomas caught Ada's arm, and they went through the cabin door and he barred it, and the second shot came through the window. The third hit the door. The fourth hit the wall to the left of the fireplace, and Thomas heard it pass through the log and come to rest somewhere in the interior, with a sound like a hammer strike on green wood. Ada was loading with the speed of someone whose hands had been doing this long enough that the mechanism didn't require attention from the front of the mind. She moved to her corner, the angle that covered the rear door and the east window simultaneously, without discussion, because she had identified that position on her first evening in the cabin and had been noting it ever since. "They'll come through the front," she said, not asking. "Reading and the rear," Thomas said. At the same time, the door came in on the second heavy blow. A man threw it in the shape of the smoke and noise, large across the shoulders, moving fast, and Thomas put him on the floor with the rifle stock before the man had oriented to the space. A second man behind him caught the door frame as Thomas pulled it back. Not a tactic, an accident that worked, and the resulting confusion bought 3 seconds. From the rear, Ada's rifle. A sound outside that settled the question of the rear door permanently. Then a beat of silence from that direction that held. Through the broken front door, Thomas saw the yard. 2 riderless horses at the clearing's edge. One man holding his arm at an angle that explained the riderless horses, and Curtis Holt, standing exactly where he had been standing, and the look on his face was the first thing Thomas had seen from him that carried genuine new information. Not anger. Not surprise. Exactly. Something more precise than either. The expression of a man whose model of a situation has been revised by incoming data he had not factored into the original calculation. He had not expected this. Not the resistance, he'd planned around resistance. What he hadn't planned around was the specific shape of it, what Ada had become, or what she had always been, and he had failed to accurately measure. Holt raised his rifle. Thomas moved left. 2 shots in the span of a single breath. Thomas felt the burn of the second pass across his right hip. Not the stopping impact of a hit in a vital location, but the precise hot information of a wound that was real and would need accounting for. He staggered 1 step, stayed up. The mathematics of staying up were simple enough. The only category worse than this one was the other one, and he wasn't entering it tonight. Holt's left shoulder had a new relationship with the situation. He was on one knee in the snow, his rifle in the yard beyond his reach, his right hand moving toward his holster with the determination of a man who has not yet accepted the terms being offered him. His eyes found Ada. She stepped out from beside Thomas's left shoulder. She moved without hurry, the unhurried movement of someone who has arrived at a decision through a long process and is completing its final step. She lifted her rifle and both of her eyes were level on Curtis Holt, and he looked up at her from his knee, and in his expression was something Thomas had not expected to find there. Recognition. Not of Ada as he had always categorized her. Recognition of something that had not existed in his model of her. Something his model had not had the architecture to contain. She said, "You put your mark on my face to make certain no man would ever want to look at me again. You were wrong about that." Her voice had the flatness of granite, of something that has been under pressure for a long time and has simply stopped moving. "And you were wrong about something else," he said. What, she said. I was never yours to mark, she fired. Curtis Holt went down into the snow and stayed there. The remaining riders, 2, possibly 3, Thomas couldn't be precise in the dark, turned for the tree line without further communication between them, or with Holt, because there was nothing left to communicate about. The sound of their departure diminished into the pine timber, and the cold absorbed it, and then there was only the wind and the creek somewhere under the ice, and the fire in the cabin, still burning through the open door. The clearing was quiet. The snow came down lightly, the way it comes down after the main event, a secondary consideration, an afterthought of weather. Ada walked into the yard. She walked to where Holt lay and she stood over him, and Thomas stood in the broken doorway and did not speak and did not move, because this was not his moment to occupy. It had never been his moment. He had been a presence alongside someone else's most necessary reckoning, which was a different thing from being the cause of it. And he understood the difference. She stood there until the snow had accumulated on the shoulders of her coat, long enough for the sounds of the mountain night to return to their regular positions. Whined in the high timber, the creek working under its ice, the horses moving in the damaged lean-to. When she finally turned and came back toward the cabin, her face had the expression of something that had been held at high pressure for a very long time and had, at great cost and through great effort, finally been released. She said, "Let me look at your hip." Thomas said, "It's surface," she said. "I'll determine that." She moved past him into the cabin and found the clean cloth on the shelf. In the location, she had reorganized it to 3 weeks ago and knew precisely. And she came back to the doorway where the firelight was better, and she examined the wound with the assessing calm of someone who has been making decisions under pressure and has not finished making them. It was surface. She was right to look. Both of these things were true simultaneously. While she worked, the night settled around the cabin into its final register. Thomas said, "Spring will bring official questions." She tied off the bandage. Her hands were steady in the way they had been loading the rifle during the fight. Not the steadiness of someone suppressing reaction, but the steadiness of someone who has used everything they have and found it sufficient. She said, "The only story that holds up is the true one. 5 men came to this cabin in the middle of the night with weapons and fire. The walls have the record of it. The snow has the record of it." She looked at him. "Anyone who wants to argue with that is welcome to come up here and read the evidence." Thomas looked at her, at the face that had been marked to end something and had instead marked the beginning of something. Neither of them had arrived at the mountain expecting. He said, "Your father taught you well." She looked back at him, and in her expression was something that was not gratitude and was not its absence. It was the look of someone who has been seen accurately, which is a rarer thing than being seen at all. "He taught me that the truth was the only position worth holding," she said, "because it's the only one you don't have to keep correcting." Outside, the thin snow continued to fall. The mountains stood around the cabin the way mountains stand, without opinion, without comfort, without the particular cruelty that would be required to make their indifference mean something, just there. Just continuing, which was, Thomas had always found, its own form of reliability. He stood up from the doorway, put careful weight on the hip, catalogued what it returned. Manageable. He had ridden with worse on worse ground in '64 and had gotten where he was going. Compared to that, this was a conversation. He said, I'll check the lean-to." She put her coat on and said, "I'll come," he said. "You don't have to," she said. "I know that." And she was already at the door. They checked the lean-to in the dark together. The horses nervous and needing settling, the overhang damaged, but not structurally compromised. The fire had caught the outer edge, and the bucket work had contained it before it reached the framing. Thomas made a mental note of the repairs and the materials he had on hand, and whether they were sufficient. He was making a list of practical problems, which was what he did when something had happened that was too large to hold directly, which was a habit he had developed in 1863 and which had never fully departed. Ada stood in the lean-to doorway and looked up at the sky above the mountain. The stars at this elevation, the way they only are at elevation, the whole catalogue of distance visible at once, the kind of sky that tells you simultaneously how large everything is and how small. She said, "I thought I knew what it would feel like," Thomas said. And she was quiet for a moment. Then, "It doesn't feel like I thought. It feels like the first honest breath in a long time." She looked at him. "Is that wrong?" he said. "No, and then because it was true and because the truth was the only position worth holding, it feels like what it is." not what someone else decided it should be. She looked at him for a moment that had real weight, not the weight of resolution or arrival, but the weight of two people who have come through something together that has no clean name, standing on the other side of it and finding that the other person is still there. Then she went inside to put more wood on the fire. Thomas stood in the lean-to a moment longer. He looked at the tracks in the snow. Entry, circles, departures, the record of an evening that had opened as one kind of story and closed as a different one. He looked at the tracks Ada had made, moving through the yard, the specific pattern of her steps, and he thought about a man who had stood at the edge of something he couldn't stop and what that standing cost. He thought about the difference between being present for something and being able to change it. He thought about how sometimes the only act that matters is showing up and not leaving, which sounds like very little until you are standing in the cold outside a damaged lean-to on a Wyoming mountain at 2 in the morning, considering what the alternative would have looked like. It was not nothing. It was, in the accounting that mattered, a great deal more than that. He went back inside. 8 days after Curtis Holt went down into the snow in front of the cabin, the valley below the Bighorn Range was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with weather. Thomas had learned to read the difference over 13 years of living at elevation. The quiet of a place conducting its regular business below the threshold of audibility, and the quiet of a place that has paused to see how something resolves before continuing. The valley had the second kind. He felt it the way Red felt approaching weather, without evidence he could arrange into a logical argument, with the certainty of long familiarity with what a particular quality of stillness meant. He had stopped ignoring that kind of certainty sometime around the 3rd year of the war, when ignoring it had cost more than he could afford. His hip was healing on a schedule that averaged out to approximately correct. Slower than he preferred, faster than he'd expected, the wound clean and the muscle knitting without complication. Ada had changed the dressing each morning with the same focused competence she brought to everything she decided deserved her full attention, and Thomas had allowed this because the alternative was managing it himself in poor light with one hand, and there was no tactical advantage in that arrangement. He needed flour, salt. The need had existed since the morning he'd ridden into Laramie and had been deferred by events with more immediate urgency. But Ada's rationing arithmetic had reached its limit, and the limit was now. He told her he was riding down to the trading post at the river fork. She told him she was coming. He said she didn't need to. She looked at him with the expression she used when she considered that he had said something structurally sound but practically wrong, and she said, "We face things together now." Thomas, who had operated on his own authority for 13 years and found it mostly sufficient, discovered he had no compelling argument against this, which was itself a form of information. He noted without yet knowing where to file it. They rode down together on a morning that was cold and bright. The snow on the lower slopes in the process of deciding whether it was still November or beginning something else. The horses picking their way through a landscape, caught between seasons. The trading post at the river fork was a low building that had started as a trapper's waypoint in the 1840s and accumulated function the way certain buildings do. A wall added for storage, a lean-to for horses, a second room that served as a de facto postal receiving point for the surrounding territory. The proprietor was a man named Gatch, who had strong opinions about currency and limited opinions about most other things, which made him an adequate business operator and an acceptable neighbor at this particular radius. 3 horses outside, that didn't belong to Gatch or to any regular customer Thomas recognized. He registered this before they crossed the clearing to the post, and he slowed Red to a walk without signaling Ada, because Ada had already slowed Dust and was reading the same animals with the same attention. Government shod, he noted from the hoof prints at the hitching rail. Not ranch stock, not a trader's traveling string. Inside, behind the layered smells of wood smoke and cured leather and the particular lived-in sourness of a building that had been closed against cold, for 30 years 3 men stood at the far end of the long counter. Long coats kept in good repair, boots clean in the manner of men who maintain their equipment as a professional discipline rather than an aesthetic one. The tallest of the 3 had the face of someone who had been presented with complicated situations for long enough that complexity no longer registered in his expression as anything other than a problem to be worked. He turned when Thomas and Ada came through the door with the unhurried timing of someone who had heard them coming and decided to let them come. Thomas Crane, the flat identification of a man reading from a document he has memorized. Thomas said, "Depends who's asking." The tall man removed his hat. Not a gesture of deference, a professional courtesy, the kind extended when you want the other person to understand you are not trying to obscure your face. Roy Cassidy. Territorial Marshal's Division. His eyes moved to Ada with the brief systematic inventory of a man cataloging facts. "We're here regarding Curtis Holt." Gatch, behind the counter, discovered something on the shelf to his left that required his complete attention. Thomas said, "What about him?" Cassidy said he was found dead. Shot. On his property in the Lower Valley. He did not inflect this as an accusation. He arranged it as facts in their sequence. Witnesses have placed you and this woman riding near his property the night his supply barn burned. Ada stepped forward. Not in front of Thomas, beside him, a movement small and exact that communicated something requiring no translation. "He came to our cabin with 5 armed men," she said, and her voice had the quality of something that had been prepared for precisely this conversation, and had concluded that preparation was best expressed as clarity. "He fired first. I fired to stop him from killing Mr. Crane." Cassidy looked at her for a moment longer than simple information receipt required. He was reading the scar. Thomas watched him read it with the attention of someone who already knew the relevant history and was confirming the alignment between the physical evidence and the account he had been building in his ledger. "You have proof of entry and first fire," Cassidy said. Thomas said, "Right up. The bullet holes in my walls aren't going anywhere before spring." Cassidy looked at his 2 deputies. One of them gave the fractional shrug of a man who has heard a statement and found it logistically reasonable. Cassidy looked back at Thomas and Ada with the expression of someone about to deliver information he is not offering as a threat, but which will function as one regardless of intention. "Holt has a brother," Cassidy said. "Warren Holt. Operates cattle near the Colorado border. He's posted a reward." A pause measured in professional courtesy. $500 for the woman who killed Curtis. The number settled into the room and made itself permanent. Cassidy raised one hand before either of them spoke. "I'm not here to collect. My office doesn't operate that way." He picked up his gloves from the counter with the deliberate care of a man reclaiming his footing after voluntarily setting it down. "Bounty hunters don't work by my code. $500 is a figure that motivates a specific kind of professional who has no interest in due process or self-defense rulings." He looked at Ada directly. "I need 10 weeks to build a ruling that holds in territorial court. During those 10 weeks, men who are not me may come up the mountain." Thomas said. "When do you need to see the cabin?" Cassidy said. "Tomorrow morning." Thomas looked at Ada. She was already looking at him. The exchange lasted about 2 seconds and carried more information than most conversations managed in considerably more time. Thomas said, "Come at 8. The coffee will be poor, but the evidence will be there." Something moved at the corner of Cassidy's mouth that was not quite a smile and not entirely its absence. "I didn't particularly like Curtis Holt," he said, and the sentence was careful in the way. Sentences are careful when the person speaking them holds a public position and has opinions he is legally required to keep at a specific register. But the law doesn't adjust for personal feelings. On either side, he nodded once at Ada, specifically, in the manner of acknowledging something he could not formally acknowledge. Then he left, his deputies behind him, and the door closed on the cold. Gatch sold Thomas flour and salt at the standard rate and asked no questions, which was precisely the level of civic engagement Thomas had always found most valuable in a neighbor. The ride back up the mountain in the early evening carried a different weight than the ride down. The sky was unchanged. The horses maintained the same gaits. But the silence between Thomas and Ada had shifted from the working quiet they had built over weeks into something denser. Not the weight of fear, but the weight of understanding that they were now operating inside a formal process with a defined timeline and specific named risks attached to it. Ada said, 10 weeks, Thomas said. 10 weeks. She looked at the trail ahead. And in that time, someone will come, Thomas said. Maybe more than one. $500 draws a professional class of problem. She was quiet for a moment. Then, you could tell Cassidy you acted alone. That I wasn't present for the shooting, Thomas said. That would be a lie, she said. I know, he said. Then I'm not telling it. She didn't push further. Whatever she had been testing with the suggestion, his willingness to absorb legal exposure to protect her position, or his commitment to the particular truth they had both agreed was the only defensible ground. She had her answer, and it appeared to be the one she had expected rather than the one she might have hoped for. which he found more meaningful than the reverse would have been. Cassidy arrived at 8 the following morning with one deputy and a ledger, and spent 4 hours in and around the cabin making measurements and notations with the systematic thoroughness of a man who understood that his documentation was going to be challenged by someone with significant resources and who had responded to that foreknowledge by deciding to be more thorough than the challenge. He measured the bullet holes. He mapped their trajectories relative to the doorframe and window openings. He examined the repaired door. He found the expelled cartridge casings. Thomas had swept to the side wall and counted them and recorded the count. He photographed the bloodstains on the yard snow that remained visible under the surface crust of subsequent weather. He did not speak to Ada beyond what his formal documentation required, but he looked at her scar twice during those 4 hours. Once when he believed she wasn't watching, she was, and once directly at the end of the morning, when he was closing his ledger, and he looked at her face with the deliberate attention of a man choosing to see a piece of evidence in its complete context rather than its isolated detail. He said, "The physician who treated this wound," Ada said. "I treated it myself," Cassidy said. "There's a physician in Laramie. Whitfield. He has a professional record going back 15 years and a reputation for accuracy that holds up in court. He settled his hat. If he examined this wound and provided a formal opinion regarding its nature and origin, that opinion would become part of the territorial record." Ada understood this was not a suggestion. "I'll ride down," Cassidy nodded. He left. Thomas stood on the cabin porch and watched the marshal's tracks diminish into the lower timber, and then went back inside and found Ada at the table with the maps, her finger resting on the trail down to Laramie as if confirming a route she had already decided to take. "He's on our side," she said. Thomas said. "He's on the law's side," she said. "Right now that's close enough to the same thing to matter." The weeks that followed had their own rhythm, different from the rhythm of early winter and different from anything that had preceded it in Thomas's experience of this mountain. Ada made trips down, once to Whitfield, who examined her scar and wrote 4 sentences in a professional ledger that Thomas suspected were among the most consequential 4 sentences currently existing on paper in the Wyoming Territory, once to confirm with Cassidy that the investigation was tracking its stated timeline, and once simply because she needed to see something other than the same timber and the same granite shelf for a few hours. Thomas understood this without requiring an explanation. 13 years of choosing the same view had taught him the difference between a view that feeds you and a view that begins, over time, to consume something you hadn't budgeted for the consumption of. On her second trip, she brought back a newspaper from Laramie, 3 weeks old, the kind of paper that reaches a territorial trading post by the time most of its news is history, but she had found in it a notice regarding the formal posting of Warren Holt's reward, and had folded the page to that notice and set it on the table for Thomas to read. He read it. He set it back down. Neither of them said anything about it, because there was nothing to say that the notice hadn't already said in its stark official language. $500. Ada Merrill, formerly Ada Holt. Wanted for questioning in connection with the death of Curtis Holt of Laramie County. Information leading to the location and apprehension of the above-named individual to be compensated at the above-named rate. Wanted for questioning. Which was the legal language for something that was not legally a conviction and was not legally an accusation, but occupied the space between the two, where money and influence did their most effective work. Thomas folded the notice back into the newspaper and put the newspaper in the fire. The attack from the bounty hunters came on a Tuesday afternoon in the 4th week, and it came without the warning that Holt's approaches had carried. No circling tracks the night before, no voice from the dark, just Thomas checking the north trap line near the ridge saddle, and then 2 shots from positions he had not anticipated, which meant whoever had come had spent time watching the cabin's daily patterns before committing to the engagement. Professional, in other words, which was what $500 bought. He was behind a fallen pine log with a wound in his left thigh, not deep, but bleeding with the enthusiasm of a muscle hit that had decided to make its objections known at volume, when he heard dust coming through the upper timber at a pace that the terrain at that elevation did not encourage, but that Ada had apparently decided was acceptable given the circumstances. She came through the last stand of lodgepole and read the situation in the time it took her to bring dust to a stop and drop the reins. Ground-tied, trained, staying put without being told to. She took in Thomas's position behind the log, the 2 shooter locations across the clearing, the angle of incoming fire, and the blood darkening the snow around his left leg. And she did all of this in approximately 3 seconds before she was moving. She went low and moved east through the brush at the clearing's edge, using the terrain the way someone uses it who has been reading topographic maps since childhood, and understands that the line on the paper corresponds to something real and navigable. The shooter behind the boulder was focused entirely on Thomas. His partner behind the second tree had a compromised right arm. Ada's work, Thomas realized, on the approach he hadn't witnessed, and was managing his rifle one-handed with the frustrated determination of a man who had not planned for this variable. The man behind the boulders stepped into the open. He had judged that Ada's attention was committed to his partner and that the moment was available. 500 says she's worth more than him, he said to the clearing at large, the way a man speaks when he believes he is the only person in the room with a complete picture of the situation. He was not the only person in the room with a complete picture of the situation. Ada came up behind him out of the brush at the eastern edge and said, "Turn around." He turned. She put the rifle stock across his temple with the accuracy of someone who had calculated the required force and applied it without excess. He went down into the snow with the finality of a man who had made a significant miscalculation. The second hunter looked at his partner on the ground, looked at Ada, looked at his one functional arm, and made the arithmetic work in the only direction it could. He ran into the tree line, moving fast, the sound of him departing absorbed quickly by the timber. Ada crossed to Thomas. She crouched beside him and pressed both hands against the wound with the immediate competence of someone who has assessed the situation and moved to the most urgent item on the list, without pausing to rank the others. Thomas looked at her hands and looked at her face and said, "You came up alone," she said. "You would have done the same," he said. "That's not," she said. "I know it's not an argument, it's a fact." She kept the pressure steady. "Can you ride?" he said. "Yes." She helped him up with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone who is stronger than she looks and has known this about herself for long enough that it no longer requires acknowledgement. They got him onto Red with the horse, standing calm and cooperative in the way that horses sometimes do when the situations around them has exceeded the normal register, and they have elected to be useful. Ada rode beside him on the way down to the cabin, close enough to catch him if the hip decided to renegotiate their arrangement. The afternoon light, coming flat and gold through the timber. For 2 days after that, she stayed at his side. She cleaned the wound twice daily with water boiled on the stove. She made broth from dried venison and whatever she could find on the reorganized supply shelf, and she brought it to him at the cot without discussion, because discussion was not what the situation required. She slept a few hours at a time and was awake when he woke in the night, sitting in the chair by the fire, with the rifle across her knees, in the posture of someone who had decided that vigilance was the appropriate response to the present moment, and had committed to it without complaint. On the second night, rain came, the first rain of late December, which in this territory was itself a kind of announcement, the weather systems losing their confidence about what form precipitation should take. It tapped against the roof in a minor key. Thomas lay on the cot and looked at the ceiling and listened to it, and then looked at Ada in the chair and said, "You could ride to Cheyenne, get a lawyer to establish your legal standing as Holt's widow. Take what's yours from the estate by legal right, and start over somewhere east where nobody knows your name or your face." She looked at him. She let the suggestion sit in the air for a moment, giving it the consideration it deserved before setting it aside. "I don't want somewhere nobody knows my face," she said. "I want somewhere someone sees it." A pause. "I want this," Thomas said. "This." He looked at the cabin, at the walls with their repaired bullet holes, at the lamp throwing its limited light against the dark. She said, "This." She held his gaze without equivocation. "They put a sack over my head and sold me like I wasn't a person with a name and a history, and a father who taught me everything he knew. You were the only one who saw me standing straight, a beat. I'm not running from that." Thomas reached out and took her hand. Deliberate, unhurried, with the full awareness of what the gesture meant, and was not trying to be more than it was. She let him hold it, and did not pull away, and did not add anything to the moment that wasn't already there. Outside, the rain continued in its uncertain way, neither committing to winter nor releasing it, the mountain above them doing what mountains do, through all weather and all seasons, which is to continue. The morning of the 14th of February arrived cold and clear, which felt like either providence or coincidence, depending on your views on the relationship between significant events and atmospheric conditions. Thomas saddled both horses. Ada came out of the cabin in her good wool coat, dark, well-kept, preserved through everything at the bottom of the pack she had carried from Laramie, with the care of someone who had known she might need it someday for exactly this kind of occasion. Her hair was arranged. The scar on her left cheek was exactly where it had always been, and she was making no adjustment for it whatsoever. They rode into Laramie at 7:30. The main street was the same main street, the same wood frame buildings in the same positions, the same coal smoke smell, the same frozen mud in the same configurations, the specific unchanged geography of a place that had been the site of the worst morning of Ada Merrill's recent life, and was now also going to be the site of something else. People on the boardwalk stopped and watched them pass, not with hostility, not with welcome. With the suspended attention of a community that has been waiting to find out what it thinks about something, Ada rode without adjusting her pace or her posture or the direction of her gaze. She looked forward. Both of her eyes were open and level, and she met the eyes of the people who looked at her with the steady composure of someone who has decided that what she is does not require negotiation with an audience, regardless of the audience's size. Thomas watched this from his peripheral vision and said nothing, because she had made every decision that mattered before they reached the edge of town. The town council hall was the largest interior space in Laramie that wasn't a church or a saloon, which under the circumstances was appropriate. Long benches filled the main floor, a raised platform at the front with a table for the official party. Roy Cassidy at the table, ledger open, the posture of a man who has done this enough times to have a posture for it. To his left, a man in a suit that had been purchased somewhere that took the construction of suits seriously. Warren Holt's lawyer from Denver, whose name was Fielding, and whose presence communicated the level of resources being deployed against Ada's account of events. To Fielding's left, Warren Holt himself. Bigger than his brother had been, broader through the chest, with the look of a man who had traveled a long way to express something he considered both righteous and overdue. The room was full. Every bench occupied, standing room along the walls taken. Thomas recognized faces. Gatch from the trading post. Two men he knew from years of supply exchanges. Earl Pruitt near the back with the particular expression of a man who has been hoping not to be referenced, and is beginning to suspect the hope is unrealistic. And in the third row on the left side, the woman who had been sitting in the front row at the auction, the one who had turned away. She looked at Ada when Ada walked in. Then she looked at the floor. Fielding presented his case with the polished confidence of a man who had been hired for his ability to make an arrangement of selected facts sound like a complete account of events. 3 points, developed with skill. Ada's documented history of instability, as recorded in Curtis Holt's own papers. The suspicious nature of a woman who had abandoned a legal marriage to take up residence with an unrelated man, and the calculated character of the supply barn attack as evidence of premeditation that undermined any claim of defensive action. He was good at what he did. Thomas had to acknowledge it. The sequence he constructed sounded internally coherent if you hadn't been on the mountain. Cassidy let Fielding finish. Then he called Earl Pruitt to the front of the room. Pruitt navigated the walk from the back bench to the platform, with the body language of a man who has been hoping that civic invisibility was a viable long-term strategy, and has just discovered it is not. Cassidy walked him through the auction with the methodical patience of a man who knows exactly what each question will produce, and is asking it for the record rather than for information. The rope, the burlap, the bidding, the terms. Pruitt answered in the compressed syllables of someone attempting to be technically accurate, without being morally accountable. And the room heard every word of it, and the quality of attention in the room changed. Cassidy called Whitfield next. The physician's testimony lasted 4 minutes, and used precise professional language to say 2 things. The scar on Ada Merrill's left cheek had been produced by a sharp instrument drawn with controlled, deliberate force consistent with intentional application, rather than the irregular wound pattern associated with accidents or mutual struggle, and the geometry of the mark was consistent with an act of sustained and purposeful intention rather than impulsive violence. Fielding objected twice. Cassidy noted both objections, paused, and continued. Then Cassidy said, "Ada Merrill." She stood. She walked to the front of the room and turned to face it. And for a moment the only sounds were the fire in the corner stove and the street noises coming through the walls and the held breath of a room that had been arranged for this. She spoke for 8 minutes. Not with performance, and not without feeling, with the flat, carrying accuracy of someone who has decided that the facts in their sequence are sufficient and require no decoration. She described the night Holt died the same way she had described it to Cassidy at the trading post. Location, timeline, the sequence of the attack, her responses, the outcome. When she reached the moment of Holt coming through the broken door, she did not slow down or speed up or adjust her register. He was not there to negotiate. He had come with 5 armed men to a private home in the middle of the night, and Mr. Crane had already been shot, and the man who had stood in my kitchen 2 years earlier and cut my face while I held still was standing 6 feet in front of me reaching for his pistol. I fired because the only alternative was to watch him finish what he'd started. The room held its breath. Fielding said, "The witness provides an account with no independent corroboration." Cassidy said, "The bullet holes in the cabin wall are corroborating. The 5 sets of horse tracks documented in my survey are corroborating. The expelled casings from 5 distinct firearms recovered at the site are corroborating." He did not raise his voice. He appeared to have a very large reserve of controlled patients available for professional deployment. The physician's formal assessment of the wound on Mrs. Merrill's face is corroborating. The testimony of the auction operator regarding the conditions under which she was sold is corroborating. He looked at Fielding with the expression of a man who has laid his complete hand on the table. "Do you have physical evidence that contradicts any specific item in my documented record?" Fielding looked at his papers. His papers did not contain physical evidence that contradicted any specific item in the documented record. Warren Holt said something to Fielding, and Fielding said something back, and the quality of that exchange was the quality of 2 men calculating whether a position is worth continuing to defend when the cost of defense is becoming visible to everyone in the room. Cassidy said, "The death of Curtis Holt on the night of the 22nd of November 1884 is ruled justifiable self-defense under territorial law. This matter is closed to further proceeding in this jurisdiction." He closed his ledger. "Mr. Holt, you're welcome to pursue this matter in federal jurisdiction at your own expense. My complete documentation will be available to both parties." Warren Holt stood. He was a large man, and standing made him larger, and he pointed at Ada with the concentrated anger of someone who had come a great distance and spent considerable money to arrive at a result he had not wanted and could not accept. He said something about justice, something about his brother, something about the money and influence that were supposed to have made this outcome impossible. Ada turned and looked at him. She did not speak. She turned and looked at Warren Holt with both of her different colored eyes, and she held his gaze without flinching and without looking away and without adjusting anything about herself to accommodate his anger. And after approximately 10 seconds of this, Warren Holt stopped speaking. Not because she had argued with him, because she hadn't. Because she was simply standing there, present and complete and entirely unmoved by the performance of his outrage, and the performance required an audience willing to treat it as something other than a performance. And she was not that audience. There is a silence louder than any argument. Ada Merrill had been practicing it for most of her adult life. She had simply found, at last, the room where it carried. They walked out of the town council hall into the afternoon light of a February day that had decided, provisionally, to be warmer than the morning had promised. The main street was still the main street, but the quality of the watching had changed. Nobody laughed. Nobody turned away. The woman from the 3rd row was standing near the dry goods store. She looked at Ada with an expression that was not apology. Apology would have required more courage than she had assembled, but was something in the vicinity of it. The acknowledgement of someone who has seen something clearly, possibly for the first time, and finds the clarity uncomfortable enough to register on the face. Ada looked at her without stopping walking. She did not offer comfort or condemnation. She looked at her the way you look at something that is simply present, seen, noted, and not worth altering your path around. Thomas said, "How are you?" She considered this with the attention she gave to questions that deserved real answers rather than functional ones. Like a room that has been closed for a long time and someone finally opened the window, she looked at the street, the same buildings, the same frozen mud, the specific unchanged geography of a place that now held 2 different mornings in its record rather than one. It doesn't fix what happened. The people in that room will go home and talk about it, and some of them will talk about it wrong. But I stood in there and said what was true, and they had to sit in their seats and hear it. Thomas said, "They heard it." She said, "Yes," a pause. "They heard it. They rode back up the mountain in the late afternoon, the sun dropping behind the western ridge in the abrupt way it drops at this elevation in February. The temperature falling with it in degrees that were real and immediate, the horse's breath visible and steady in the cooling air. The trail was familiar now in the way that routes become familiar when you have traveled them under enough different circumstances that each passage has added something to the record. This switchback in ice, that saddle in deep snow, the viewpoint where the south face opened onto the full extent of the valley below. Ada stopped dust at that viewpoint. She sat on the mare and looked at the valley in the last of the light, at the Holt Ranch in the far distance, the white house no longer lit, the property beginning to take on the looks of something that had stopped mid-sentence and not found its way back to one. Thomas stopped Red beside her, and they looked at it together without speaking. Spring came the way spring comes in Wyoming, not graciously, not in a straight line, but in argument with itself, one warm week followed by a return of cold, followed by a week warmer than the last, the snow pulling back up the slopes by degrees, and the creek working its way through its ice from underneath, with a sound like distant structure shifting. Wildflowers appeared at the margins of the south-facing slopes first. Small things pressing up through the last of the cold mud, with the specific urgency of organisms that have been waiting for precisely this convergence of conditions. One evening in late May, Ada was standing outside the cabin, watching them grow along the creek bank. Thomas came out and stood beside her, and they were quiet together for a moment, in the way they had learned to be quiet together, which was different from the silence of one person, and different from the silence of two people who don't know what to say to each other. She said, "Do you regret it?" He knew what she was asking without needing it specified. "Buying you," she said. "Yes." He looked at the mountains across the valley, at the Bighorn Range in the long evening light, at the place that had been his chosen solitude, and had become, at some point in the past 6 months, something he no longer had adequate language for. "I thought I was interrupting something," he said. "Turns out I was starting something." He looked at her. "I don't regret what I started." She turned to look at him. In her face was the expression of someone who has been waiting for the room to be ready. "You never asked me," he said. "Asked you what?" she said. "To stay. In all of this, you've never actually asked me to stay." The evening held its position around them, the birds settling in the timber, the creek running clear over its stones, the last of the daylight spreading gold across the high granite above the tree line. Thomas turned to face her and took both of her hands in his, the hands of a man who had spent decades doing physical work and were at this moment being used with the care they were capable of when the moment required it. He said, "Ada Merrill, will you stay? No courthouse, no paper if you'd rather not have paper, no preacher unless you want one. Just this mountain and that creek and whatever years are coming." She looked at his hands holding her hands. She looked at his face. She thought briefly about what she was comparing this to, and found that the comparison required almost no time because the things being compared occupied such different categories that placing them side by side required a significant effort of imagination. On one side, a transaction completed before she had fully understood its terms, in a house in a valley, under the authority of a man who had confused ownership with relationship for so long that he had lost the ability to see the difference. On the other side, this, a man on a mountain in the last of the May evening light, holding her hands like something worth holding, asking rather than telling, waiting for her answer rather than assuming it. She said, "Yes, no preacher, no paper, no witnesses except the pine trees and the running water and the early stars appearing above the eastern ridge, one by one, in the order they had always appeared." Thomas Crane and Ada Merrill stood in the last of the light and made a promise that had the particular quality of things made freely and therefore built to hold. The summer came in strong and generous, the kind of Wyoming summer that makes the preceding winter feel like it was worth the investment. Thomas built another room onto the north side of the cabin, extending the main structure with the same hand-hewn logs as the original, the same steep roof pitch, the same careful chinking. Ada designed the space on the back of one of the old topographic maps, a pencil sketch that was better than what Thomas would have produced on his own, which he acknowledged without equivocation, because it was simply accurate. The room was finished by August and smelled of new pine and wood shavings, and the clean resinous promise of recently worked timber. One morning in the last week of August, before Thomas had come down from the loft, Ada was standing outside in the early light with her hand resting on her stomach. Not quite a gesture, not quite the absence of one. When he came out, she turned, and he read what was in her face before she said anything, which was the face of someone who has received information they were prepared for, and still finds it larger than the preparation accounted for. He stood with it for a moment that had real dimensions. On his face, and Ada would think about this later, in the privacy of her own thoughts on many subsequent occasions, was an expression she had no single word for. Not relief, though relief was present. Not happiness exactly, though that was present too. Something older than both, the expression of a man who has been carrying a specific weight for a very long time and has just been told, in terms he can trust, that he is allowed to set it down. He put his hands on her shoulders. She covered them with hers. They stood that way in the August morning, while the creek ran, and the horses moved in the lean-to, and the mountains around them did what mountains do, which is to continue in their ancient and indifferent permanence. Not cruelty, not comfort, just the honesty of things that exist on a scale that makes human timelines look like a single season. In October, a letter arrived from the Laramie Town Council, formal, sealed, written in the bureaucratic prose of territorial government doing its official work. Ada read it at the table. She read it to the end. She folded it along its original creases and held it in both hands for a moment. Thomas watched her from across the room. Keep it or burn it. She held it a moment longer. She looked at the shelf, the Bible with the maps folded into its back cover. The small collection of objects a cabin accumulates when two people have been living in it long enough to leave their marks on its organization. Then she stood and crossed to the shelf and opened the small wooden box she had placed there in the spring. Keep it, she said. She set the letter inside the box and closed the lid. One day our child will ask what kind of woman their mother was. She looked at Thomas across the room, with both of her different colored eyes, with the scar on her cheek that had been made to end something, and had ended nothing, that had in fact marked the beginning of the longest and most necessary chapter of a life that was not finished and had never been broken. I want them to know she was the kind who walked into the room where people had decided she didn't matter and said what was true until they had to hear it. Thomas looked at her. He said, she was. The first snow of the new season had started sometime in the previous hour, falling soft and without opinion, settling into the pines and along the creek bank, and on the roof of the cabin and on the roof of the new room, covering everything in the patient white that Wyoming returns to, eventually regardless of what has happened in the interval. The mountains stood in it, as they had always stood. The creek ran under its forming ice. The lamp in the cabin window threw its light against the early dark. Years later, travelers coming down through the Big Horn, Paces in summer would mention, when the conversation turned to the country north of Laramie, a man and a woman who kept a place on the upper slope of a particular mountain. The man was tall and economical with words, and listened with the attention of someone who had long ago concluded that most things worth knowing arrived at a register below speech. The woman had eyes that were two different colors, one green, one gray, and a scar along her left cheek that she carried with the ease of someone who has decided that what it means is her business and nobody else's. She could read terrain by the angle of light and identify approaching weather by the way air moved through a particular stand of timber, and she shot with the composed deliberate accuracy of someone who had learned that precision outlasts speed in every situation that matters. There was a child. Reddish hair, quick on its feet, known to run between the cabin and the creek on summer mornings, and back again for no clear reason except the pleasure of the distance. People said you could hear the child's voice from the valley. On still days when the air was right for carrying sound upward, that was probably an exaggeration. But the people who said it were not entirely wrong about what they were trying to describe, which was the particular quality of a sound that carries, because it comes from a place where it is welcome. Thomas Crane had spent $30 at an auction in Laramie, Wyoming, on a November morning in 1884. He had not gone to that auction. He had gone for flour and salt, and had found himself standing in front of a wagon looking at a woman who was standing straight in the middle of something that was doing its considerable best to make her stop doing that, and he had found, despite 13 years of careful management of his own involvement with the world below the timberline, that he could not make himself turn away. He had thought he was interrupting a transaction. He had not understood, standing in the cold mud with $30 in a leather pouch, that what he was doing would take more from him than $30, and give him more than he had calculated on receiving, and that the arithmetic of the whole thing would turn out to be the only arithmetic of his adult life that came out clearly in the right direction, Ada Merrill had never been broken. That was the truth of it, the truth that Curtis Holt had built his entire understanding of the situation around being false. And that had turned out to be the foundational error from which all his other errors followed. She had been a woman standing straight in the middle of something trying to bend her, and she had outlasted it, and the scar it had put on her face was not a record of what she had lost, but a record of how long she had held, which is a different kind of record entirely, and she had known this about it from the beginning. Thomas had simply been paying enough attention, at the right moment, to see it from across a crowd.